I'm turning on the recording now and turning it over to the marvelous Brian Jones and Siobhan, who will introduce themselves.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian C. Jones. I'm a person who's been thriving with AIDS for 37 years and advocating probably half that time. I thought it was important to have this conversation in discussion with Kim, and knowing many people who have been in the space with me, I was often tired of being looked at as being the angry Black man in the room. And the reason why I say that is because many people didn't understand my journey and didn't understand my fight. If you don't understand what I've been through, then you won't understand my walk. So I thought it was important for people to get an understanding that as a Black man or Black individual in America, of what we have to fight through and what that really looks like, as opposed to having these perceptions of us. Um, so I knew in order to have this conversation, I had to bring somebody on who could give you those tangibles, because a lot of people need tangibles. Um, oh, so I spoke with Kim in reference to this conversation, and she recommended a wonderful individual, Siobhan Boyd Nelson, who works with Equality Ohio. But I also want to say a quote from a comedian. He says, "The worst place for a Black person to live is in the mind and imagination of a white person." And let that sink in for a minute, because a lot of times, many times, white people don't see who is right in front of them or taking me for the individual that I am. They see the perception and the stereotypes and all those beliefs of whom they think I should be as a Black man and how I should present myself. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Siobhan. Siobhan, could you come on and introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Siobhan Boyd Nelson. I am the Director of Development and External Relations at Equality Ohio. I was so excited when Kim and Brian invited me to take part in this month's webinar to talk about having a race equity lens. We are in an incredible moment here in this country where people are asking questions that they have not asked before, and they're asking them in ways that have not been asked before. And I think it's an important opportunity for us to offer tools for how to do the work. So we're going from our heads, what's in our heads, our thoughts, and actually in a space where people have a bit more willingness to actually put those thoughts into action and to make some change in our country. So I'm excited to have this conversation with all of you and to talk about applying, developing and applying a race equity lens to the work of HIV/AIDS advocacy. I think I'll go ahead and share my screen now, if that's okay with Kim and Brian, to get us started with the presentation. And I will look to Kim to see if that looks okay with everybody.
Yeah.
All right, wonderful. So, like I said, my name is Siobhan Boyd Nelson, and Brian Jones is also here, and we are going to get started. So I'll just start out with a brief introduction of Equality Ohio and what we do. So we identify and transform systems and institutions so LGBTQ plus Ohioans can fully access legal and lived equality. And we do that in a number of ways. We do our work in different areas, such as at the State House or with state level agencies. We do it through municipal policy work, local non-discrimination ordinances. We have a legal clinic where we are helping LGBTQ Ohioans whose income is within 300% of the federal poverty guidelines. And then we do public education programming so that folks understand who LGBTQ people are and where our intersections are, because we aren't just LGBTQ, we are also that and other things. And I want to be clear that we are always here as a resource and that this is a judgment-free space. We are speaking on things that we live and we do. We are speaking about our personal identity, but we want to make this accessible to you. We want you to be in a space where you can ask questions, get the knowledge so that you can start making changes in your individual lives. So what does being LGBTQ have to do with being Black, and having a race equity lens? And here we have a quote from Marsha P. Johnson, one of the elders of the LGBTQ liberation movement, someone who has not gotten as much focus as she deserves. And I just want to bring up a quote here. History isn't something you look back at and say it was inevitable. It happens because people make decisions that are sometimes very impulsive and of the moment, but those moments are cumulative realities. And I love that. Like what to me, that is a very empowering quote. We don't just have to let history happen. And this is a very momentous, historic moment that we are here in this country, but we don't just have to let it happen. We can actually be driving what exactly the history that we are making right now in this moment. So that as we go into this session, I just want to encourage everyone to take hold of the power that we have in this moment to drive the action that we want to see happening. And a reminder that the LGBTQ liberation movement was led by Black and brown folks. And that Stonewall was a riot, and it was led by people of color. So when we know that when some of us are not liberated, all of us are not liberated. We can't be, it's hard for me as a Black woman, as a Black queer woman to say, I'm proud of my identity over here, but my Black identity is problematic here in America. I need my entire self to be free, to be liberated, which is why as LGBTQ people, digging into the Black Lives Matter movement is so key. So Equality Ohio and race equity, we've had a journey and we are doing this work. And that is why we are coming to you to present the work that we have done and to offer the learnings that we have had and some of the tools that we have used. So we've been on a 24+ month process to develop a strategic framework for the entire organization that has a race equity lens. And what that means is that no matter what we're doing in our work, we are applying a race equity lens and saying, how does this impact Black and brown people differently than it impacts the dominant culture? Because we know everything does, and we need to be cognizant of it, and we need to be direct and upfront about it right from the beginning. So this is our value here that you see on the screen that Equality Ohio developed during this process, that racism is unique, systemic, and persistent, and addressing it within ourselves, communities, policies, laws, systems, and institutions is vital for the transformation we seek and need. So as LGBTQ plus people, we believe that fighting for racial justice is key to our liberation. As LGBTQ plus people, we can't do part of the work without doing all of the work.
Okay, I would like to say something. Just as background for me, another reason why I really wanted this conversation to move forward, because as a Black same gender loving Muslim, I had so many isms against me and a lot of xenophobia. And I also understood that as a Black man, as part of the LGBTQ community, I often didn't consider myself accepted within the LGBTQ community because I realized that racism and discrimination existed under the rainbow flag. Also, I never considered myself gay because I understood early on that the gay agenda was deeply rooted in white supremacy or white privilege. Because I realized that as I followed the fight as a young same gender loving man, that Black folks, although they were a vital part of the fight, were never put in the forefront. And it appeared to me that we were being added in to make it appear all inclusive. So there was this problem with me. And then as I start to hear now in recent years, when you hear about civil rights, I hear civil rights as it relates to LGBTQ people as in terms of marriage and using bathrooms and those things. So as a Black man, we fought for civil rights in the 60s. So something had been taken away from me as a Black man first, which was civil rights. And the term civil rights, when you hear it now, is being applied to the LGBTQ community, which is fine. I'm all for people having that, but it's taking something from the Black experience. So I just had to say that.
Absolutely. And then, Brian, I think, yeah, will you go ahead and tell us about OHMM?
So the Ohio Health Modernization Movement is a coalition of people, of organizations and individuals dedicated to ending the criminalization of HIV in Ohio. As you can see what the mission statement is there, but I'll deviate from that. We came together because we needed to change the landscape of what HIV and AIDS look like. And by doing that, the government can't have it both ways. You could either treat HIV or prosecute HIV. You can't tell us on one hand that it's a manageable chronic condition, and then when it comes to prosecuting people, saying that it's a death sentence. In order to treat HIV and for us to get ahead of this pandemic, we needed to look at these laws and modernize these laws and change them so that they don't carry the stigma attached to them. And so that's what the Ohio Health Modernization Movement works to do, is to bring together people from all walks of life who may be stakeholders and who may not be stakeholders to help change these stigmatizing laws. And they don't protect the public health as they were designed to do. And in order to change the way people look at us living with HIV, we need to address these laws. So that's what the Ohio Health Modernization Movement works to do. And I think at the end, there's another slide. If you'd like to be involved in this work, we welcome you to come do as much or as little as you like to do. Thank you.
Thank you. So what does racial justice have to do with HIV criminalization, Brian?
Well, I think it's important to not treat HIV as this lone man on this island. I think people with it stands to reason Black folks are most impacted by HIV and AIDS because we're most impacted by everything else. And as we look at the intersections, you can't help but to look at the injustices, and mass incarceration is real. I think we have to start from that point, because HIV criminalization laws is just another tool in locking us up. If we stand to be most impacted by HIV and AIDS, it only stands to reason that we're most impacted by these unjust criminalization laws. And just like we're denied access to treatment, we're also put at the forefront when it comes to prosecuting people based on these criminalization laws. We do know that there are many cases that we can follow, but we can only follow them if a person takes it to trial. Many times people plea bargain out, and that's a big issue for Black people and people of color. So we have countless people, countless cases that we don't know of people who've been prosecuted under these laws because they plea bargain out. So we've got to understand that racial justice, or shall I say racial injustice, for us when it comes to prosecuting us, because there is no justice. These laws are based in a person living with HIV. Normally the law says you're innocent until proven guilty. But when it comes to these criminalization laws, you're guilty until you prove yourself innocent. So I think this comes to stand. Everybody has their own perception of what this statement means. And I think we can move forward and allow people to take on their own thoughts as we move through this presentation.
All right. So let's talk about intersectionality. And there's a lot of intersectionality that we're going to talk about today. We're already talking about the intersection of LGBTQ identity and race, right? But then at the same time, you've got gender, you've got poverty, you've got geographic location, and all of these things matter when we're talking about health and health outcomes, and also when we're talking about our criminal justice system. So we're talking about two big systems here, the health system and the criminal justice system. They're two systems that are plagued with inequity, particularly around race lines. And then when we do this, when we have this intersection of and we add in gender and poverty and all those different things, there's a lot of things going on here and a lot of things to consider. And then you've got all these social drivers, the mass incarceration, the violence, the homophobia and transphobia, unemployment, low educational attainment or access to education. All of these are playing together to make the conversation about HIV and AIDS very complicated, right? You cannot have this conversation without seeing all of these different things and the way that they impact the person. Because this is people first, right? People first language. All of these different things are going to impact the person who is living with HIV and AIDS. Brian, did you want to say something about intersectionality?
Well, I think the intersectionality, I think it's important to look at that. And like I was saying before, we've got to stop treating HIV and AIDS as a single issue fight, because our Delors says there are no single issue fights because people don't live single issue lives. HIV is just a symptom of the larger problem. And the larger problem is what we're addressing today, the social and structural disparities that keep us at risk. We're not at risk because we have more sex partners or more drug use or anything else. We're at risk because of the system is broken. And I think we've got to look at the system and the intersectionality in order to move the conversation forward.
Right. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at all these different things that play into race equity. We're going to look at a lot of terms. And then at the end, we're going to get down to 3 essential things. What can you do personally to address racism within yourself? What can you do internally within your organizations, your workplaces, the places where you are doing HIV/AIDS work to address racism? And then what can you do externally in the communities where you're working to address racism? So that's where we're eventually going to go with all of this today. So a lot of what we're doing today is about becoming white accomplices. And here's the reality. It is a journey and you got to commit to it. This is not something that you can pick up on a Tuesday, or that can be a hobby or something that you're kind of going to be into and maybe not. It is a conscious choice that you have to make to be anti-racist. And it's a conscious choice that you have to keep making over and over and over again. Why? Because we're going to talk about culture and the way that culture just surrounds you and you can't get out of it. So you have to keep fighting the dominant culture, which means you have to keep making this choice every single day. And you have to start internally. You can't expect to show up at work as an anti-racist person if you haven't done the work to be an anti-racist person. You can't show up at work one way if you're not actually that way at home. This takes starting with the personal. So you have to confront your own privilege as a white or white presenting person and understand that that isn't going to feel good. That's the bad news today, y'all. It's not going to feel good. This is, and that's unfortunate. And there are ways to work through that. Just because it doesn't feel good doesn't mean it's a bad thing. There are much better feelings, much stronger feelings on the other end. But when you're going through it, you are going through it. I'm a big fan of the buddy system. I think everything is more fun with a friend. In this sense, I might say it's less painful with a friend. If you are finding that this is hard work to do, I encourage you to find somebody to do it with so that you have an accountability partner, somebody who's going to struggle with you in this. And also know how you learn best. Don't try to do this work and read all the books if you're not a reader. That's not the way to do anti-racism work, okay? You need to lean into your own learning style. If you learn through music, I promise you there is a playlist that we can find you that is going to help you do some anti-racism work through music, through podcasts, through books, through movies, through TV shows, through YouTube. We can find the way that you can learn this. There is something out there for you. And so lean into the way that you learn best. And we will share resources throughout this presentation. Then donate. And then go ahead, Brian.
Oh, no, I was going to say, and in the beginning, this may appear to seem contrary to everything you have walked in or have been taught. It's like learning how to ride a unicycle when you've been riding a tricycle all your life. It's a whole nother balance system. And also some things to remember is sometimes when you're invited into our space, we don't need you to talk. Sometimes you can learn more by just listening. And another thing, we don't need you to save us. We can save ourselves. We're not looking for a hand down, we're looking for a hand up. in some spaces. And we'll talk more about leveraging your privilege later.
Absolutely. And then, so you can donate to Black-led causes, though. I mean, if you are a donor, and it's part of what you do, absolutely lean into some Black-led causes, and then show up. And as Brian said, showing up doesn't mean talking. Showing up doesn't necessarily mean leading. Showing up means showing up and being present. Honestly, that's listening, and that's doing work when you're there in those spaces. And then asking what is needed. If you show up in a space, in a Black space as a white person, it is always okay to say, I am here and I am willing to work. What do you need? Ask for leadership. Allow yourself to be led in these spaces.
And just because you donate doesn't mean that you, well, I should say, Lady Jan Ridgway, who runs Garden Valley, always told me, when people donate money to her organization, don't give it to me and tell me what I need to do with it. If you're giving it, allow me to do the work that I need to do. Don't have the money coming with disclaimers and what I need to do with it. If I give the money, give it freely to allow Black folks to do the work for Black folks.
Absolutely. Here are just some acronyms really quick to make sure that we're all on the same page. LGBTQ, lesbian, bisexual, gay, transgender, queer. SGL is same gender loving, as Brian referenced earlier. POC is people of color. It's a very broad term. BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. That's when you are saying specifically Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So let's talk about some terminology. This looks really deep, but this is the core of what we're getting into. So what is race equity? It is the condition that would be achieved if one's racial identity no longer predicated in a statistical sense how one fares. So notice the assumption there, the reality there. In America, your racial identity does predict in a statistical sense how one fares in this country. In a health sense, for education, for employment, overall wealth in your lifetime, it matters. Your racial identity matters. So when we're using the term, we're thinking about it of race equity as one part of racial justice. And so we also include work to address root causes of inequities, not just their manifestation. So we're not just trying to get rid of the product of racism, we're trying to get rid of the racism itself. And that's the difference here. So this includes elimination of policies, practices, attitudes, and cultural messages that reinforce differential outcomes by race or fail to eliminate them. So it's not just enough to get rid of those things that obviously are making differences, but also getting rid of those things that fail to eliminate differences, which is a different level of diving in than we've done in this country before. And so when we say a race equity lens, what we're saying is a perspective or worldview that actively, action there, and with intentionality considers the ways in which racial inequity, particularly anti-Black racism, creates disparities in nearly all US systems, policies, practices, attitudes, and works to eliminate them. So if you are applying a race equity lens in your workplace, you are looking at literally everything you do and asking yourself, how does this policy or practice implicate or affect Black people differently than white people? And you're asking yourself that question explicitly, you are being open to every answer, and then you are finding ways to actively address those inequities that you have pointed out. That's what it means to have a race equity lens.
I would like to raise a question, not that there will be an answer right now. If asking people to apply this race equity lens in their workplace, many of them are not ready to give up parts of their privilege. And sometimes by applying this race equity lens in their workplace, there may be other structural entities that may deny them some of those fundings that they took for granted. And we all know that everything is supposed to not be about race and that kind of thing, but we do know that a lot of the funding streams are impacted by how privilege is displayed, whether it's a meeting before the meeting conversation, or it's not a conversation that we're privy to, but we do know if they've always had this a filtered or rose-colored lens as they were doing the work. And now they're changing it to be more inclusive of Black people. Everybody's not cool with that. And
Right.
everybody's
Yeah.
not going to be cool with that. So
Yes.
I just want to pose that question out there. I know that it's going to make you feel uneasy, but if you're about fighting for the right thing, then right is right. And the wrong road is always the wrong road. And it's never too late to turn around and go the right way. So it's going to be a battle. It's not going to be easy. So
Right.
I just want to make
No,
that.
Brian, you bring up a very big point. There are consequences. This isn't easy. There are consequences. So you're going to put on this race equity lens and you're going to see some things and you're going to be willing to make those changes. And there are going to be consequences. There are going to be consequences for your funding. There are going to be consequences to your donors. There are going to be consequences on your board or on the way that you do the work. Absolutely. And the reality is that those temporary consequences, you have to weigh those and say, so what is the bigger outcome? What does race equity lead us to? So, and Brian, you were kind of alluding to this. So in this country, we have tried to be race neutral. If anybody grew up in the 80s and 90s, I don't see race, right? Being race neutral was the way that folks were going to go about this. And it's an attempt to address racial disparities without directly targeting benefits exclusively to racial minority group members. So we're going to say, Black people, I understand that you are not getting an equal opportunity or access to education. But instead of actually handing you more education, as Black people, we're going to do this in a race neutral way. And so in doing so, the idea is that we can help minorities without hurting majorities so that we can shift. It's almost trying to shift power without shifting power, shift privilege without shifting privilege. And what we have found is that hasn't been very successful, to be quite honest. It has not done what it was proclaimed it would do. And instead, what we're moving toward is anti-racism. And what anti-racism is the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing the system, the organizational structures, the policies, the practices, so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. So race neutral, we were doing our best not to redistribute power. And an anti-racism is just a reality. It's our reality check. You have to redistribute some of this power and equitably share the power. Because when what we're essentially talking about in this country is who has the power, who has access, who has privilege. All of these things are connected. And until we are willing to do some redistribution, we aren't truly going to address those inequities fully.
I read something that said that white women benefited more from affirmative action than Black folks.
Absolutely. I think that there are, and I cannot say that for sure, but I believe that there are studies that I have seen that have said that.
Yeah, I just read something like that and I was like, wow. You know.
So that's racism. So we talked a lot about racism and race equity. Let's talk about culture now and the power of culture. Culture is kind of something that can be a little bit difficult to define, but it's a hidden force. It is this thing that surrounds us all, and it influences every part of our lives and our society in which we live. It's often invisible. We can't actually see it or like pinpoint it. And it's difficult to identify because it's always present, like we're swimming in it. It's like if you ask a fish, what temperature is the water? How's the water today? The fish is going to look at you and what are you talking about? Like they're swimming in the water. It's always there. And our collective culture is essentially a default way of behaving and of perceiving behaviors. And so there's this piece of science that I found that says that the research has found that culture influences the way a person's brain perceives visual stimuli such as scenes and colors. Think about that. Scientists and researchers have been able to show that our culture actually influences the way that our brain perceives colors. Now, colors are colors, right? I mean, that is a thing, a fact is a color. And yet culture is so powerful that it can change the way that our brains perceive what is, quote unquote, an objective fact, right? So that is the power of culture. Why is that important? Because of white supremacy culture, the culture that we live in here in America. So white supremacy culture, or dominant culture, if that is more comfortable for you, is the idea that white people and the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to people of color and their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions. And in America, this is Western European ideals that came to America and were founded here and then have grown to be American or white American culture and what we consider normal here. And those are really captured and encapsulated in the habits of white supremacy, which is a tool that I hope everyone here will grasp and lean into, because it's helpful when trying to identify those cultural traps where you need to apply your race equity lens and take a step back and say, ooh, I'm defaulting to something. Should I be defaulting to this, or should I be applying a race equity lens? Should I be critiquing this and looking at this differently? So what are the habits of white supremacy? Those are the characteristics of white supremacy culture which show up in organizations as our default, as the right way of doing things. And this, again, it talks about how powerful culture is simply because it is so present and at the same time difficult to name or identify. And these habits are damaging because they're norms and standards which aren't proactively chosen by the group. We just kind of fall into them. There was no conversation to say, this is the way that we want to behave. This is the way that we want to act. These are the standards we want to live by, or that we want to act by in this organization. These are just what the culture has told us is the right way. And we know that these habits of white supremacy do not serve people of color. And they do not serve people of color both within the organization and outside of the organization. And that's why we need to interrogate these habits of white supremacy and be sure that we're not defaulting into them. So here they are. Here are the habits of white supremacy. Perfectionism. That perfect, it must be perfect. Everything must be perfect. And we are going to sacrifice everything to perfection in the pursuit of perfection. A sense of urgency. Everything's got to be quick. Everything's got to be fast. Everything has to come. We can't slow down and consider things. Defensiveness. When we're told that we're wrong, when we're questioned or challenged and we get defensive about it, we're not open to critique. Quantity over quality, meaning if I have more of these things, it's better than if I have two things that are really strong. We see this a lot in America. Worship of the written word. This one's a really big one. There are so many cultures around the planet and even here in America where the spoken word is strong. The spoken word is how you pass down history. It's how you pass down realities and culture. But in America, in our dominant culture, we prefer the written word. We say if it's not written down, then it didn't happen. And that can discount those who believe or who are stronger in their spoken language. And we discount the power of spoken language and the fact that it can have just as much truth and just as much power, even if it's not written. Either or thinking, it has to be one or the other. I like both and. Both and is my favorite phrase. Power hoarding, believing that all of the power has to be with one person, that we can't distribute power equally, but that power has to be concentrated within certain places or certain people. Fear of open conflict, that meaning that we can't have a disagreement in public. That would be horrible if people saw us disagreeing, when actually open conflict, open disagreement can actually be generative and it can actually bring about good things. Progress is bigger, more, same thing as quality over quantity. Objectivity, the idea that there is an objective point of view, that you can be objective, that we're not all subjectively seeing things and perceiving things. And then the right to comfort, the right to be comfortable, just because you are. And really the reality is that so many people in our country aren't comfortable every single day. As a Black queer woman in America, I am uncomfortable 75% of the time. I do not have a right to comfort because I am not part of the dominant culture. However, folks who exist within the dominant culture believe that there is a right to comfort. And when their comfort is challenged, then they perceive the person challenging their comfort as wrong in some way or not behaving appropriately.
I would like to say about the perfectionism one. I think for me, they tend to think that everything they do is perfect. at sacrifice of all costs of other things. And a lot of times they realize that it's not perfect, but they convince themselves and put on a facade that this is the way to go. And that right to comfort thing is the reason why I'm perceived as the angry Black man a lot of times, because I work on the philosophy, if I have to be uncomfortable in the room, everybody in the whole damn room is going to be uncomfortable. Our Dolores says, your silence doesn't help you, nor will my silence help me, so it's better to speak. And I'm going to speak at all costs. So.
Absolutely. So here we are back to intersectionality, and I wanted to get back to Kimberly Crenshaw, Black law professor who termed the phrase intersectionality a number of years ago. And it is a prism where you can see the interactive effects of various forms of discrimination and disempowerment. It means that I am Black and I am queer, and that doesn't double my the ways that I am discriminated against and disempowered. It's actually exponential. Every time you add a different level of intersectionality, there is an exponential layering of disempowerment and discrimination that happens there. And so it's a prism through which you can see that overlap and that vulnerability that is created when folks live at these intersections. And then Intersectionality 102 is challenging folks in the racial justice world to also have a critique of patriarchy and homophobia in the particular way that racism is experienced and exacerbated by heterosexism and classism. So in the beginning, intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black woman, and she was looking at the way that her gender and her race were intersecting to create this legally, it was a legal quagmire. She was in a legal void. She couldn't, there was a specific case out of the Supreme Court where if you were a Black man, there was a remedy. If you're a white woman, there was a remedy. But as a Black woman, there's no remedy. You were just there in the void, and it was because of that intersection. And so that was this specific view of intersectionality there. And so Intersectionality 102 says, okay, now let's add another lens to this. Let's look at the ways that heteronormativity and patriarchy also lend to this and also creates voids and also creates more discrimination and disempowerment in our communities, and how we need to broaden our lens to see all of that and how they work together. All right, so here we are. Here's the good part. Racial equity and HIV. How do we address them? How do we, the art of walking and chewing gum at the same time? How do we do racial equity and HIV work, advocacy at the same time? All right, so here are the at-risk populations for HIV in Ohio. When we ask the question, what does racial justice have to do with HIV? Well, it's right here. Black or African-American Ohioans make up only 12.5% of Ohio's population, but account for 45% of all new HIV diagnoses. And that's a rate nearly 7 times higher than the rate for white Ohioans. And that is significant. Brian, do you want to speak on this?
Well, I'll let you finish that, then I'll chime in.
Okay, so this is where race matters. So when you are doing HIV advocacy work and you don't have a race equity lens, are you really doing the work? Are you doing the work that is going to meet this statistical data, these realities, right? So if you are not approaching HIV advocacy work with a race equity lens, if you're not looking specifically at yourself in your own relationship with racism, your own relationship with Black people and how you interact with Black people, if your organization is not looking at your relationship with Black people within the organization, how are you going to be able to do the work that addresses this obvious discrepancy that is impacting Black people so much more than it's impacting white people? And that may mean, the reality of that is you may need to do something in your organization that is not race neutral, that is anti-racist, right? That specifically addresses the needs of Black people because their needs are obviously greater than those of white people. So having a race neutral approach to that statistic isn't going to make that statistic change.
And then you look at your organization. If your organization serves 68% Black people, and you have a staff of 20, but you have 2 Black people. Something is wrong with this, because Black people, as well as Latino or Native Americans or Pacific Islanders, they need people who look like them, live like them, and talk like them, so that they can see themselves in those people whom are represented in your office. If you're trying to reach the transgender population, you need transgenders in the front office, not in the back somewhere, or not as a volunteer, but someone who is paid to do the work. Also, it's important that we hold our health departments accountable in this, not just in your specific organizations, because a lot of this is the larger systemic problem. Because as we look at the branding that comes from our health departments when it comes to HIV and AIDS, for instance, we know that young men who have sex with men between 13 and 24 are the largest growing population of new diagnoses. So the health department says, and the CDC says, 1 in 2 young men between a specific age will contract HIV in their lifetime if they don't change behaviors. They put if they don't change behaviors as an afterthought, as opposed to saying 1 in 2 men do not have to settle for HIV diagnosis. The way that it's presented as if you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, you're going to get it one way. One of you is going to get it either way, as opposed to saying you don't have to settle for it because there are tools out there that you can utilize that can change behaviors. Now, another thing is they say Black people are more at risk or are a targeted population. I don't know whether that targeted population means you put a bullseye on our chest or what, because you're saying I'm a targeted population because I'm more at risk for contracting HIV. That's where that whole racial lens comes in, and the inequity or the racial discrimination in this whole thing, because they make it seem like we have more risk when we have no more sexual partners than our white counterparts. Our drug use is no more rampant than our white counterparts. We don't really share any more sexual partners than our white counterparts. But the branding and the labeling that comes through the health department is where the bigger problem arises.
Absolutely.
So right there.
Yeah. And the stigma, there's a lot of stigma. And so when Brian talks about having Black people up front, having trans folks up front, a lot of it is fighting the stigma. There is huge stigma around HIV and AIDS. We know that in this country still. There's a huge stigma just around healthcare in general. And race isn't a social determinant of health. Racism is the social determinant of health. It is the impact of racism on Black people that is determining their lower health outcomes. So the stigma and discrimination is creating chronic and acute stress, which is then complicated by the HIV or AIDS diagnosis, which is then complicated by other realities in your life of being LGBTQ, of being living in a certain neighborhood, having a certain level of income. And these things all impact your mental health, your physical health, your access to care. And then that's when you have those health disparities for folks who are Black.
So what do you say about this? I know these health departments are starting to say that racism is a health, forgive me for the word, they're saying that
it's a public health crisis.
What, could you give me that word again? They're saying racism is
it's a public health crisis?
A public health crisis. What's your take on that? I mean, do you think this is really going to do any good, or is this just some more verbiage just to say we're looking at it?
I think it's a good reframe. I think it is a good reframe from getting away from essentially blaming the victims, blaming Black people, or allowing the thought to be that Black people just have worse health, right? And so it's taking it away from Black people are a public health crisis, and it's becoming the racism against Black people is the public health crisis.
But what are you going to do about it? I mean, just saying it, wow, we did change the language, but we're still not doing anything. We're not making equal access to care more accessible for you. We're not doing anything to make your comprehensive health any better. So just saying it if you're not going to do anything, if you're not going to exterminate some of these people who are causing this public health crisis, just like you prosecute people who you say intentionally transmit HIV. What about people who intentionally put racism out there, like the guy on Pennsylvania Avenue? So if you're not willing to charge some of the people in leadership positions, then why even say it? Because there's no consequences for it. If I had syphilis and I was having sex with people, you would be trying to prosecute me. So if it's if racism is a public health crisis, then what are you going to do about these people who are perpetuating it?
Absolutely. It is definitely an invitation. It is not the end of the conversation. It is an invitation to dismantle the racist system.
Or is it something to patronize us and throw us a little something and say, okay, we said this, now we're starting the conversation, but when it's really, now you know why I'm back.
Well, let's get to some accountability, Brian. So how can we make folks accountable? So here we go. Here, racism in healthcare, this is a reading and watching list that I found at the University of Washington School of Medicine. And it allows you, if you are in the healthcare field, all of these are wonderful places to start to think about the healthcare system as a racist system. And you really do have to wrap your mind around that. No one wants to believe that our healthcare system is racist, but it is. And the sooner that you get to that point, the sooner you can get to dismantling it, right? As Brian says. So we've said the words that the healthcare system is racist. Now we have to get to dismantling it. But this is the reading and watching list to start that process of understanding just how that system is racist. And then, as I said earlier, there are 3 steps to this for dismantling racism within the healthcare system, within HIV and advocacy work. It is a personal journey, it is an internal organizational journey, and it is an external journey. So personally, these are the things that we are asking you to do. This is how to be accountable to the statement, racism is a public health crisis. You got to get real about race. What races are present in your life and at what levels of intimacy? Who do you know? Who do you hang out with? What role has race played in your life, in your family, or in your community? Do you live in a suburb that used to be redlined? Do you know the history of redlining in your community? Have you ever thought about it? Do you know the history of race in your family? Do you know if anybody in your family ever passed? I know I have a history of race in my family that includes folks who passed and who left the family in order to do that. You got to get real about what the role that race has played in your life. You got to get real about racism. How has it shown up in your life and in your family? And how have you addressed it or not addressed it in the past? How does it continue to show up in your life? And how are you complicit in its perpetuation? And honestly, one of the best ways to be complicit in the perpetuation of racism is not to talk about it. It's to be silent or to be neutral about it. And that is the way that we allow these things to continue. And then you got to act. Oh, go ahead, Brian.
I also think you have to be honest with yourself, because a lot of times you say, well, I'm not, it's the old cliche thing. Some of my best friends are Black, or that kind of thing. But I think you have to be willing to look at the practices that you have and say, these are racist practices that I have and that I have inherited by growing up and walking in privilege. Sometimes you have to be totally honest, brutally honest, maybe not to nobody else, but to yourself. Because sometimes you will convince yourself that these are not racist practices. And if you're not honest with yourself, you can never begin to do that real internal work, because you're constantly making excuses for the things and the practices that you do. I can't fault you for walking in your privilege and enjoying it, but I can fault you for not addressing it when it shows up in other places. So.
Yeah, it's that right to comfort. We all want to be comfortable. And this is truly saying you have to get uncomfortable and you have to act. It's what Brian's been saying. You cannot just say the words, you have to act. So what anti-racist, not race neutral habits and practices are you willing to commit to? This is a personal question. How deep are you willing to dive here? Consider where you shop, where you eat and drink, where you vacation and play, and where you choose to live. Those are all choices that you have that can be anti-racist choices if you choose. And then here, Our resources for applying a race equity lens personally. Please note that your Black friend, if you have one, is not on this list. That is not a resource for you. I'm going to ask that you go to the books and do the learning, or find a white presenting person to do this work with. The Racial Healing Handbook, a lot of doing this race equity work is about healing. It's about healing for yourself, not just for Black. This isn't Black folks healing. This is all of our healing. This is healing work we all need to do. Me and White Supremacy, wonderful workbook that a number of folks have used, and it's a really good starting place.
And I would like to say something. And just as an example, if you're sitting among friends at a cocktail party or something, and someone starts to have this racist conversation, or by using racist slurs at someone, you may think that by not joining in, that you're being anti-racist. Unless you say something, I mean, you're being neutral in that space because you're not joining in, but that doesn't make you anti-racist. Unless you say something, speak up, do something to correct the action that is taking place, only then do you become anti-racist. El Hajj Malik Shabazz, who is Malcolm X, says, you don't become a diner just by sitting at the table. You have to eat something to become a diner. So in order, while you're in that conversation, you don't become anti-racist just by saying, well, I'm not going to join in with what they're saying. You've got to eat something in this conversation, meaning check somebody when they need to be checked.
Yes, absolutely. Very good. Yes. And there could be consequences to that. Let's be very honest there. There could be consequences. You could lose some relationships, and we believe it's worth it. If you're willing to do the anti-racist work, sometimes that's what is required. So what about internally to your organizations or workplace? Again, get real about race. What races are present in your organization and at what levels of power? If race is concentrated at the hourly level and not at the salary level, okay, there's something there that you got to address. And what role has race played in your organization in the past, even if you weren't there? Even if it's not your current ED, get real about what role race played and maybe some missteps that your organization took in the past. Get real about racism and the way it shows up in your organization and how your organization addresses it on a daily basis. And how is your organization complicit in the perpetuation of racism? So just like in that personal conversation that Brian said, if you're seeing something as racist or is anti-Black in a personal conversation, what are you seeing as an organization? Where does your organization need to step up and say, hey, we are seeing this as part of the system of work. This is anti-Blackness in this system, and we need to make a statement as an organization about the anti-Blackness or the racism that we're seeing here. Same concept there. And again, there may be consequences to doing that. And then what anti-racist policies and practices are you willing to commit to? And some ideas, these are just the starting place. You're hiring. Who do you hire? What does your hiring process look like? Where are you posting jobs? What are work schedules? What do those look like? Why are your work schedules the way they are? Because it's 9 to 5 and that's what America does. Does that serve the people that work for you? Does that serve the people that you're serving? What about vacation time accrual and usage, health insurance? All these different things are different ways to create anti-racist policies instead of just using the cultural norms, really getting in there and interrogating those norms and seeing, do they actually serve the people that we are trying to serve?
I know we're trying to get through this slide, but I want to just say one thing, and I'm going to be quiet because I know you need to get through this slide. I want to say we have to understand that skin don't make us kin. Just because a Black person is there doesn't mean that they're speaking from a Black perspective or fighting from a Black that lens of equality for Black people. Also, within your job, you need to stop looking at some Black folks who speak up as being confrontational. That's one of the characteristics you give us when we're speaking up about what's right. And you've got to have to be willing to put people in positions who are not just there to get along and who are in your corner to get along. You've got to put people in those positions who challenge you to do the right thing and to tell you the truth.
It's so true, Brian. Just like culture is what we all swim in. Just because I'm Black doesn't mean that I'm not swimming in the same white supremacist culture as everyone else. We are taught the same things. We are told that that is the default and that's what we need to be living up to. So often, so Black people are not immune from dominant or white supremacist culture, and we are not immune from using those same tools or defaulting to those same things as white folks. So that's a very good point, Brian. Thank you. And then as you'll see here, here are some things here. Again, your Black coworker is not on this list. I'm gonna be very clear there. Go ahead. Everyone's responsible for their own learning here. Really wanna lean into the Management Center. The Management Center is phenomenal. Really encourage folks to look into them. And then externally. So how are you doing this work externally? You know your clients are Black and they know that they're Black, but do they know that you recognize the implications of their Blackness? Okay, have you said explicitly, we know that you're Black and we know that because you're Black, these are the implications for your life and we are going to address them. This is getting away from race neutral and addressing the issue head on. Say Black. Say the word Black, please. White people, you got to get comfortable. Same way that I tell folks to say LGBTQ, you got to get comfortable with the terminology. I don't know how people are going to get comfortable with the people if they're not comfortable with the terminology. Get comfortable with the terms and concepts of Blackness. Get comfortable with the terms and concepts around racial equity and having conversations with your clients and colleagues around those concepts. And then you got to implement those equitable practices and policies externally. You have to change the policies and practices that have a disparate impact on Black, Indigenous, and people of color, even if the other folks in your field are not making those changes, even if your funder is telling you you can't make those changes. We have to keep pushing back and saying, I am serving Black, Indigenous, and people of color. This is the community that needs to be served according to this data. And this is the way that we best serve them. We serve them by explicitly meeting their needs, explicitly addressing their Blackness and the way that anti-Black racism is creating disparities for them in this work. So consider centering Blackness. And people feel like when you center Black people, you are hurting anyone who isn't Black. And I will challenge you to say, if you center Black people, if you center the folks who are lowest, you're going to raise everybody up with them. And then, so here are a few resources for applying that race equity lens externally and looking at different ways that you can reach out to the folks that you're serving and be more explicit about the ways that you are recognizing their Blackness, recognizing racism and the way that it plays out systemically in our country. All right, Brian. We made it. We had to run there at the end. And this is the information for the Ohio Health Modernization Movement. Brian, do you want to talk more about the meetings and how you meet and how folks can get connected?
Well, like I said, I think you can do as much or as little as you want, but we do need you. You can contact Kim Welter. Her email address is there, or you can call Equality Ohio to find out more, or you can reach out to me on Facebook, Brian C. Jones on Facebook, or just holler right now and before this ends and say, hey, I want to be contacted. So feel free to join in. A lot of times you care about HIV criminalization laws, you just don't know it. That's a quote from the Cell Project. So become a part. We need everyone, all hands on deck. So.
Awesome. And then I do want to make sure that we give a shout out to the Equality Ohio Legal Clinic. This is a free legal clinic for LGBTQ Ohioans across the state. If you are within 300% of the federal poverty guidelines, we can help you with no fee for a number of civil matters. There's our 1-855 number. Plus, you can reach us online at equalityohio.org/legal-clinic, and you can fill out an intake form right there online to get served. I'll reach over to send it over to Kim now. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Everybody, the link is in the chat for CEUs. Everyone's invited to do the evaluation, but if you do want CEUs, you need to do both the quiz and the evaluation. Thank you, everybody. It is 1 o'clock. I will leave this open a little bit longer so you can grab that link. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.